Coming up next on the Witness the World podcast, the sweet taste of recovery.
When you do meth or cocaine or heroin, you are hitting your brain with dopamine at up to 10 times the amount of dopamine that you get from the best orgasm you've ever had in your life, the best steak dinner. So it wants reward. It loves those feel-good chemicals. And every time you give it something to feel good about, it says, wow, that felt great. I want more of that.
G'day, everyone. Welcome to episode 33 of the Witness the World podcast. I'm your host, Ben Choi, and today we'll be heading to the United States to learn, grow, and evolve as we become better versions of ourselves. We'll be chatting with a former entrepreneur who's battled years of chronic alcoholism and addiction. He later found a way to rewire his brain to break the chains of addiction. His mission now is to help others find a path to recovery by using neuroscience. We're pleased to have with us George Haymaker. Thanks for joining us today.
Hey, Ben, great to see you. And thanks so much for having me on. Really appreciate it.
So, George, when I first started reading a bit about you, I thought to myself, your story is very relatable to many of us out there. You had established a career, and over time, the stresses of life started to pile up. You made some choices to cope, but eventually you hit a bit of a wall. So, to start us off, could you please share a bit about your background and how you discovered your path to recovery from alcoholism and addiction?
Yeah, I'm happy to. The story actually starts in childhood. And, addiction didn't come until a little later in life. But, you know, all of what we are at any given moment is a summation of all of our past experiences. So all of our current thoughts, feelings, actions are all a result of what's happened to us in the past. So in my case, I had a challenging upbringing. I was privileged in many ways. I didn't want for anything in terms of, lifestyle. But I grew up in a very strict family. My father was a high achiever, a corporate climber. So we were moving every year or two. So the effect on me as a child was that I was constantly in and out of environments, having to say goodbye to friends, meet new friends. It caused a lot of uncertainty in my own self-worth. Always the new kid, always being made fun of, that type of thing. Also, my last name's also Haymaker, so got made a lot of fun about that. And then my parents were very strict, as I said. There was a lot of physical discipline in our home, a lot of spanking with belts and that type of thing. And then additionally, in fifth grade, there was some sexual abuse from some older boys. And so compilation of all those experiences caused me to be a little uncomfortable in my own skin. A lot of self-doubt, self-esteem issues, just uncertainty around who I was being good enough. And that upbringing had contributed a lot to that. And so, my parents also moved to Australia when I was in ninth grade, and we decided it would be good for me to stay in the US and go to boarding school as a better way to get into American university. So I was kind of fending for myself from ninth grade on, seeing them once a year. So all of these past experiences that I had had growing up, and it's the same for anyone, really helped mold and shape my brain into the neurological organization that I carried with me into adulthood. And so that's what happens to us is we have these experiences, and then as we live each day, the new thoughts, feelings, and actions that come into our minds are a result of what's happened to us in the past. So if we're uncomfortable and have had challenging upbringings, then it's highly likely that our current experiences are going to be uncomfortable as well. And that's why people have these uncomfortable thoughts and feelings and emotions and behaviors, because they're reenactments of what's happened in the past. They're patterns They get stronger and stronger the more we repeat them. And so they get stuck. So what happened to me is I went to college and I found drugs and alcohol. And, I found it to be a great way to cope with all the anxiety and discomfort I was feeling mentally. And unfortunately, I have a lot of addiction in my family. And so, some fun facts about addiction are if you have addiction in your family and you're traumatized as a child and you start using and drinking, in your childhood at some point, you are 8 to 10 times more likely to become an addict than someone that doesn't have those experiences. So the cards were a little stacked against me to begin with, and then I had these experiences that caused me to be uncomfortable. So that started a process of medicating with substances for a better part of 30 years, from the age of 18, up until the age of 50 when I hit a bottom. In the middle of all of that, I was a high functioning, successful entrepreneur, having started and ran several businesses. But there was always this underlying, discomfort around my mental activity. I was very reactive, very defensive, always feeling threatened anytime anybody thought or felt anything different than me. I saw that as a threat. I was very intense, and it just caused strain, on my relationships, work relationships. And, I didn't date very well. I was always in and out of relationships, I think, as a consequence of all this moving around I had done earlier. I just didn't establish long-term relationships with people. It just wasn't my pattern. And so it really, all of that early on development really affected how I was as an adult. A lot of discomfort, a lot of medicating with alcohol, ultimately pain pills. There were some other drugs mixed in there. That's how I ran my life. And so I would get highly activated, highly stressed. I would medicate with substances, and it was just this ongoing pattern. And as anybody who's ever had an addiction issue knows, it's a progressive disease. It gets worse and worse. You lose control of it. You have to keep doing more and more to get the same effect. And finally, at the age of 50, my sponge was full, and I had had all the drugs and alcohol my body and brain could handle. And I was overwhelmed. At the end, I was taking 50 pain pills a day and drinking 2 bottles of vodka. It was all day, every day. I'd lost control. My career partnership was threatened, and I finally just had to go to rehab. And that's where the turnaround started, my path to recovery.
I see. Yeah, it's quite a story there, George. So, I mean, you mentioned like rock bottom and the turnaround story. There's a lot of people out there struggling with different things that are different stages of the struggle there. Like, how did you know that you were at rock bottom? Was there like a moment or something dawned on you that this is it, and then now I'm gonna go to recovery? Did someone say anything? Like, well, what was the impetus for you to tell yourself you were at rock bottom?
Yeah. And this is the challenge that all of us have, is this idea of changing. What is it going to take for us to change? For me, I needed to hit a wall, physically, emotionally, psychologically. The consequences had to be so significant that I had no choice. If you just kind of visualize a mouse in a maze and he's taking left turns and right turns, which is what a lot of addicts do, trying to find a different way to operate their life and still use the drugs and alcohol. That was me. And until I had reached the end of the maze and I was in a room, I had scared my wife and my puppies off. I had strained about every relationship I had in my life. I was no longer able to function. I couldn't work. I was just constantly having to take more substances in order to calm my body down and avoid withdrawal. And I just knew that I was at the end. And so for me, the consequences had to be piled good and high to where there was no more way out. And that's what caused me to then take the advice of my family. They all told me I needed help. And I finally acquiesced, I guess, and went into rehab.
I see. So it's almost like your mind, body, and soul, and then just kind of new, and then from your my family, they kind of said something that kind of hit home. So it was maybe a combination of things, would you say then?
Yeah, Ben, I would say that everyone knows along the way that things aren't going well. They may still be able to manage, which is why they put off change. But at some point, there's just no other way other than to change. And that's the way it was for me. It's a shame because wouldn't it be great if we recognized along the way that these consequences were piling up and they were going to get worse and worse, and we could arrest the process then so that we didn't have to get so bad. Because, for whatever reason, my wife's still with me. She's a saint, but that she could have easily left. And as a matter of fact, I don't know why she didn't. And that would have really had a bad effect on my life because she's been my rock and my support through all of this. So, I didn't kill anybody. I had 3 DUIs. I did hit a couple of cars with people in them. So I got away easy, so to speak. But, for a lot of people, it's not that fortunate. And so, yeah, for me, I just had to really, there was no way out. I couldn't find another way to turn. And so I knew that that was the only option for me.
I see. Yeah, thanks for sharing, George. So, because now you do coaching, you help people that are, again, in different phases of their recovery and are still just trying to figure it out. And have you noticed like some kind of common patterns or behaviors for people once they hit the rock bottom? Like, are there some parallels to your rock bottom moments that compared to other people's rock bottom moments? What have you observed and seen?
Sure. Well, first of all, I want to differentiate between addiction and the other things that people encounter in their lives that are unwanted and unhelpful, right? Because you don't have to be an addict. You don't have to cope that way in order to have uncomfortable and an uncomfortable mental and behavioral life. In other words, unwanted, unhelpful thoughts and feelings where they just kind of overcome you, they run your life, they repeat, and they cause stress, and it just that worsens it. So you don't have to be an addict. So for me, there was two battles. One was to come off the drugs and alcohol and completely rebuild the reward network in my brain so that I could begin to reestablish reward for more natural life pleasures like everyone else does. So that was project one. Project two then is to then address the underlying mental and behavioral discomforts that had developed from childhood that caused me to use in the first place. Because remember that addiction is really a stress response. It's a coping mechanism. People that generally that are super comfortable in their skins and were developed in a great environment and live life to the fullest and are highly functioning and are happy and emotionally intelligent, they generally don't need to go to drugs and alcohol to cope because there's nothing to get away from. They live in a pleasant world. So most people that do use drugs and alcohol are trying to escape from underlying discomfort. So that's the other part. Is I just want to clarify that sure, we can talk about addiction, but then there's all these other people that are dealing with these discomforts mentally that, also need to recover in a sense. Because recovery really just means becoming the best version of yourself. It's a constant pursuit of every day trying to move forward, trying to create a better and better version of yourself. It's the process that's important. It's never the end game. It's just falling in love with that day in and day out desire to be better. And so that's really what my life is about now. I no longer have to worry about drugs and alcohol because I've rebuilt my reward system in my brain. So it's really just about this whole approach to how can I become that version of myself that I really want to become deep inside. So tethered to my values, my core beliefs, my core motivations, how my worldviews, like that is really what's important to me now. And that's what I arrange my entire being around, my entire life around, is pursuing that version of myself. So it's everything from what I eat to how I sleep, to how I exercise, to how I deconstruct and reconstruct my mental activity. And we can get into that if you like, because that's kind of a cool thing done through neuroscience. But yeah, so recovery doesn't have to be just for addicts.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point, George. So you mentioned about the process. It's a long process. It's almost like a lifestyle choice, almost you could say, like you to keep yourself, grounded and get that foundation. Now, during the recovery process, I want to get in a little bit more on this aspect. So when I was reading some things about you, like you transition like from an addiction of like the alcoholism, the pain pill addiction, and then over to like a sugar addiction. So there was some good stuff that came out of it. Like you got this idea for a new business venture, which is fantastic. But the aspect I want to kind of just a little drill down a little bit more on is like trading one addiction over another. And I would imagine there are lots of people out there that, you got over one thing, but then you're changing it, switching it over to another thing that maybe is less destructive, but it's kind of a slippery slope in my mind that you go from one bad thing to another. So I wondered if you can just speak a little bit about that, about like, like what are like the keys to not going from one addiction to another? Is there anything that we should take note of and to try to avoid that whole situation?
Sure. Well, actually, so I transferred addictions, as you say, from drugs and alcohol into sugar. And frankly, sugar is as menacing. I mean, it may not OD on it, but it can be long-term destructive to your health and well-being. I mean, the inflammatory effects of sugar are significant. It actually affects your brain functioning. Just picture inflammation in your brain. We kind of know what it does to our body. It does the same thing to the brain. It causes the brain to not function the way that it's supposed to. It doesn't function anywhere near its peak level. It damages certain parts of the brain. So, let's not kid ourselves that sugar is not as menacing as a lot of these drugs and alcohol. Then also nicotine, same deal. Caffeine, any kind of mind-altering substance, right? So the trick with addiction is that all of us operate at a baseline of dopamine, which is that motivational neurochemical that causes us to be motivated to do anything, like get out of bed in the day. And we operate at a level of 50 nanomoles, which is the unit of measurement for dopamine. Okay. And dopamine is one of the main feel good chemicals in our bodies that motivates us to do anything. All right. And so the way we were created was that we were given dopamine rushes, spikes, for pleasurable things that are important for us to survive and continue on with the species. So those things would be having sex. That's why orgasms feel good, is because the creator wanted us to feel good so that we would pursue sex, so that we would procreate and have more babies so the species could survive long term. That's the science behind, sex and why it feels good. Eating a great meal feels good because if we don't eat, we perish. And again, the brain's number one job is to have us help us survive. And so really what it's doing all the time is monitoring all of our body functions, our heart, all of our organs, making sure they're operating properly so that we survive. It's looking out for threats, making sure that we avoid, something dangerous happening to us. And it's also making sure that we eat food, drink water, have sex so that we and the species can survive. Okay. So when we experience those natural life pleasures, the other thing that is core and central to human beings is social connection. So when you have friends, loved ones, family, the reason that feels so good is because as cave people, we all had to group together in tribes because there were dinosaurs out there and we didn't want to get eaten by dinosaurs. And the likelihood that we could fight off the dinosaurs in tribes and groups were greater than if we were solo. And so we all banded together in these social connections to protect ourselves. And so that's why we were given that feel good to want to group together and mate and all those kinds of things. Okay. So when we experience those natural life pleasures, our dopamine goes from about 50 nanomoles, which is our kind of baseline where we're just feeling good, chill, we're wanting to live life. And then we might spike to 100. So double the amount of dopamine that's normally in our system. And then it will recede back. So when, you have an orgasm, you spike, you come back down, to this 50 level. So up to 100, back down to 50. That's kind of where we live our lives. When you do meth or cocaine or heroin, you are hitting your brain with dopamine at up to 10 times the amount of dopamine that you get from the best orgasm you've ever had in your life, the best steak dinner. So it wants reward. It loves those feel good chemicals. And every time you give it something to feel good about, it says, wow, that felt great. I want more of that. If you give it something that's 10 times the power of the best thing that it ever felt, naturally, it's going to want more and more of that. And so that's the conundrum that addicts find themselves in, is they're the reward systems of their brain, their reward networks, which is basically the limbic system, is so whacked out by this deluge of artificial dopamine that it completely malfunctions the workings of the brain. No longer we lose control. No longer does the front part of our brain, which is the executive control, the prefrontal cortex, which is impulse control, judgment, it's supposed to tell us, okay, I've had 2 drinks, it's time to stop. It completely separates the relationship there. It actually does damage to the front part of our brain. We don't think as clearly. We don't remember things as clearly. That's why when your brain's not functioning as well, when you're in a fog because you're doing drugs and alcohol, that's what's happening. And so then the only thing that's important anymore is the drugs and alcohol, especially as you go down the curve and become an addict. So what we have to do there is separate from drugs and alcohol and give it time for those neural pathways that have developed that represent the addiction. And that's what's happening, is neurons are connecting together in the brain that represent this addiction. And they are super strong because of the level of dopamine that's traveling through these connections. And so the only way you can recover is to give it time and space away from the drugs and alcohol. And then what happens is, and these neural connections are like roots from a tree. And so just think, like, if you did not fertilize or water a tree, weeks and months and years, eventually those roots would grow weak and begin to die out. That's what happens with neural connections in our brain. If we no longer use drugs and alcohol, those strong neural connections that look like branches and roots in our brain, they begin to weaken and go dormant. Okay, so we have to do that while we are reintroducing normal life pleasures that we will again find energizing and rewarding and fulfilling. So it's that process of reintroducing all of these, rebuilding one's life in recovery, introducing new things back into this person's life that they can now begin to enjoy. They're never going to get the spikes of dopamine that got over drugs and alcohol. They have to get over that. Okay, we're going to operate now back in that band of 50 to 100, but we're going to rebuild this person's life with activities and pursuits like becoming the best version of themselves in every way possible and all the things that go into that. But all these different activities that they really find that they enjoy, and then we practice them over and over again. What happens when you practice things over and over again, like you did with addiction, is you build new neural pathways. So while the addiction pathways are going weaker and more dormant, the healthier pathways are now forming because we've introduced the fact that we've actually gone through the repetition of, okay, let's do something new that's healthy. Let's say we start working out again. And so now we're going to build new pathways around exercise. And exercise releases some feel-good chemicals. And we say, okay, that felt good. And let's keep doing it. And so the more we do it, the better it feels and the stronger those connections get, until gradually over a period of months, up to a year, this transition takes place. And now we've rebuilt this person's life with all of these new activities that they can pursue that make them feel good and give them different types of feel good chemicals like endorphins, serotonin, things that kind of warm from the inside. They're not these dramatic spikes in pleasure, but they are these feel good, warming, they well up within you. I think we all know what the difference between what feels good deep inside our souls and our hearts and what feels good, like we buy a new Porsche and we get this spike of dopamine. So it's a whole different type of reward. So I know I'm rambling a little bit, but hopefully that addressed, you
Yeah, no,
know.
that's good insights there, George. So I think one of my key takeaways here is I mean, no matter what type of addiction, whether it's, I mean, you mentioned like, like let's say alcohol addiction, sex
Yeah.
addiction. I mean, maybe there's like a cell phone addiction. Like it all comes down to the brain processing dopamine, and maybe some substances or activities will create a more intense dopamine hit process. But at the end of the day, what's going on in the brain, it's the same process, it's just a different intensity. Is that fair to kind of like summarize that way?
Very much so. So whether it's an addictive substance or addictive behavior, gambling, sex, shopping, you name it, they are all delivering dopamine spikes that are in excess, especially as we become addicted, higher than normal life pleasures. Okay. And they basically begin to make that thing the most important thing in our lives because the dopamine reward is higher than we can find in other aspects of our life. And they begin to capture our attention at the expense of other things.
Gotcha. Yeah, thanks for your insights there, George. So, like I said, another aspect of the brain I wanted to kind of dive into and curious to hear about your learnings over the years is like the two parts of your brain of like the conscious mind and subconscious mind. So, this is an area I've kind of, dug a little digging in for myself. And from my learnings, it's like if those two parts are not aligned, that's when things are kind of become a little off for you, and you're not integrating, new behaviors if you can't like dig into the subconscious and really understand things. So I wonder if you can speak a little bit about that and how important it is like to find that alignment between the two, or maybe you have a different perspective. So I'd love to hear it.
You bet. In order to create change in the brain has very specific ways that it wants to learn and change and will accept change and process it in a habitual way. And so, really, what we need to look at is a partnership with our brain. And the brain is there to serve us if we serve it. So, what I mean by that is we have to treat it in the way that it wants to be treated so that it can perform at its highest, most optimum level so that it can produce change. Because, again, the brain's number one job, the way it was wired, okay, that comes with us when we're born, is to conserve energy and to help us survive and make the world around us predictable. So the brain doesn't like uncertainty. It doesn't like not knowing what's going to happen. And so it tends to avoid those things. It likes to stick in its patterns because it knows what those patterns are. And if it hasn't killed us yet, it knows it probably won't kill us. Okay. So that's the framework that you need to look at your brain. And that's really what it's there to do for us. Okay. However, it will change if we put it in its right state that it wants to, that it will willingly accept change. And then we work with it, we repeat whatever activities that we're wanting to change over and over again in such a way that the brain begins to move that behavior, thought, emotion, whatever, that way of being from our conscious mind into our subconscious mind. So the nervous system has two different states that it can be in. One is the sympathetic state, and one is the parasympathetic state. The sympathetic state is task oriented, highly attentive, like you've got something to do and your attention's focused on it, and your analytical conscious mind is focused on it. It's working, okay? You're thinking of, you're doing a project, you're in meetings, whatever it is, okay? The other state is the parasympathetic state, and that is where you're rested and relaxed. You're no longer task oriented. You can tend to daydream, think about the future, just kind of let your mind wander, and you just simply notice your body state is in a whole different state of intensity or level of activation. Okay, it's lower. All right. The brain is wanting to change when it's in parasympathetic mode, when it's rested and relaxed. You can kind of think about your conscious mind and your subconscious mind and your analytical mind in the middle, and it's a barrier. And you want all of your behavior change and thought and emotional change that you want to have change habitually, so become a part of your life It has to ultimately get into your subconscious mind to become autonomic. So things like, our breathing, all the control of our organs that we don't even have to think about, those are all back in our subconscious mind. Riding the bike, brushing the teeth, things that we've done so often and know so well how to do, they have now receded into our subconscious mind where we don't even have to think about how to do them, right? So that's ultimately where we'd like change to go in order for it to stick and be transformational, is it's got to come out of our conscious mind and then go into our subconscious mind. It won't do that unless we treat the brain well, we sleep well, we eat well, we exercise, and we're able to put ourselves in these two different nervous system states on command. And so that's a lot of what I work with people, is understanding how the brain wants to be, how to help it function at its peak level, and then how to move back and forth between these different states of being, so that when we're trying to change someone in some way, the way that they want to be changed, then we have to get them into parasympathetic mode, which then opens up their subconscious mind to receive new suggestions, new information. It becomes willing at that point. And then it's one thing to introduce something, it's another thing to have it stick and form those neural pathways so that they strengthen, so that the brain doesn't have to think about them anymore. And so that's where repetition comes into play. So if you think about learning a new instrument or learning a new language, it is very grueling at the beginning because it's up here in our conscious mind. We're having to think about everything. But eventually, as we practice, those repetitions cause these neurons to form together that represent that activity. And then at some point, it begins to then recede into our subconscious mind, and we don't have to think about it anymore.
Oh, that's good insights there, George. So, just kind of think back like about a year and a half, almost 2 years ago, I was trying to dive into my mind and trying to kind of change it up, create some new neuron pathways. And I did this by simple activity, like doing like a cold shower. So I started off hot and then end off 90 seconds cold. And something basic like that. Like I'm just trying to put myself in an uncomfortable situation. That's like, how important is that for us? Like to, yeah, just try different things to create those new pathways. So in my case, yeah, doing the cold shower, it just kind of, obviously the body doesn't like it, doesn't want to do it, but the payoff at the end of it, that I've been training my brain is like, I'm going to feel a lot more refreshed, energized, and yeah, and then after, some time, then yeah, like getting out of the shower just can get a lot more done. That is the reward. Is that like kind of a really important factor? Just trying to embrace uncomfortable things and like here and there, and just to keep the brain on a positive track.
One of the most critical elements of habit development is the reward. So if you don't tie a reward and lay that out for yourself, exactly the meaning that that activity is going to do for you in every way possible. And the parts that are really important for reward are the intrinsic parts, the parts that are tied to your values, your beliefs, your core motivations, your psychological needs, because those are longer lasting. When you tie an activity to that, you are actually tethering it to the roots of your being versus, okay, I'm going to lose 10 pounds because I want to look better. Okay. That is a surface level reward that isn't tethered to the fact that eating right and, not only just to lose 10 pounds, but just to be a better version of yourself, to be healthier, to be eating the right foods at the right times, just so that it's in alignment with your values and who you want to be as a person. That is much more longer lasting. So you definitely have to tack on reward to anything that you want to change in order for your mind to want to pursue it, because the brain doesn't pursue anything unless there's a reward in it for it. Okay. So the more work you can do around experiencing the reward, especially in a deep way, especially in an emotional way. So it's not just thinking about the reward, it's feeling the reward. How good is that going to feel? So when you're done with your cold shower, I'm hoping that you sit there and really bask in everything that that activity is doing for you. And the other thing about the brain is, even just thinking about it is the same as actually doing it. So let's say that sometimes you actually did take the cold shower. You went through the process, you felt a reward, which again adds solidification to that neural pathway. But then if you could almost start visualizing taking a cold shower, feeling the experience, and your brain thinks you're actually doing it. And so it counts as like another repetition for strengthening that neural pathway. And it's also another way of learning. So your brain likes to learn in multiple ways. It learns through sight, hearing, touch, all the rest, but it also learns through visualization. It's a different type of seeing for the brain. It's perceiving, it's interpreting. The more different ways that you can introduce that activity you want to change to your brain and practice it in different ways, the more fortifying it becomes.
Wow, those are some really good points there, George. Never thought of that. So maybe on a day after lunch, after having a heavy lunch, going back to work, for instance, maybe I should just visualize the cold shower in my mind, and I'll get a bit of a perk up maybe over time and train my brain that, yeah, that's a great experience. So yeah, good points there, George. So I want to pivot over to the recovery aspect. So I guess maybe drawing for some of your own experiences and what you've seen for people you've coached. Like, how does someone know they have fully recovered from whatever behavior addiction they're going through there? Is that possible to have 100% recovery, or are we always kind of like working on ourselves and we get to a good spot, but we have to do maintenance, I guess, to carry on, like, I guess, the positive gains that we've gotten through the recovery process. What's your take on like on full recovery, or if there is such a thing?
So in your brain, any experience that you've created in your life will have a neural pathway represented, physiologically representing it. Okay. It'll never go away completely. So if I were to start using again tomorrow, today, that pathway, which is still there, would light up like a Christmas tree, and I'd be off and running again, just like I had never left off. Okay. So when you say fully recover, that way of being that we don't like anymore is still represented in our brain. But because we haven't actively pursued it in however long, that root system has gone quieter and more dormant and weaker, but it's still there. Meanwhile, we saw that we wanted to shift and pursue a different way of being. And so we introduced that to ourselves, established the reward for it, began to experience it, and that began to form that new neural pathway. Okay, and then we repeated it over and over again. And so until it became stronger. Now, that has now become our normal way of being. But if something were to dramatically cause us to go back to the old way, there is the potential, given how strong that pathway was before, that we could immediately just revert back and head down that pathway. And that happens. That's what setbacks are. So early on in habit development, you will find that, you start down this virtuous path and you'll have a setback, right? You will revert back. And that's only natural because that pathway is still there and it is growing weaker, but it's not as dormant as it will be 3, 6, 12 months from now. And so we do tend to revert and slip back, especially when caused by stress or something else that throws us out of our, calm state. So whenever our systems get activated, stressed, we tend to just revert back to what the brain knows is comfortable, what it's experienced before. In the case of addiction, we're stressed. We feel like crap. We don't like this feeling. Our brain knows that, wow, those drugs and alcohol solved that 12 years ago. Maybe I should, that might help. Now, for me, like 12 years into it, I don't think about drinking at all anymore. Like, as soon as I think about drinking, that morning where I went into rehab is the first thing that flashes in my mind, and how fearful and helpless I was. So it's not to say that it couldn't happen. So you never fully recover. There isn't somebody that's in recovery is not recovered, they're recovering. And so you never want to look at a recovery as a end game. It is a path that you get on, the endless pursuit of being the best version of yourself. So you need to get away from the results and fall in love with the process of being better and better every day, trying new things, being curious. Am I as in control of my brain as I'd like to be? If not, and things are coming up in my mind that I don't like, what can I do to change them? What can I do to create new patterns? If I'm not eating quite the way that I would like to, what can I do to change it? This is an ongoing, never ending pursuit of being the best version of ourselves. That's what life is. That to me is the definition of life. None of us are perfect. We're human beings. So by definition, we're not perfect. So we will never become perfect. But it's that joy that you get from trying and just that reward you get, those chemicals you get from trying to be better, being more responsible person to yourself and those around you, helping others. It's that reward, that pursuit that is what recovery is all about, I think.
Well, that's well said, George. So, I guess if I got to a phase, yeah, let's say I'm someone that wanted to, start the recovery process, and I try to look at the different types of therapy. You come at it with a neuroscience angle that, there's just so many different, treatment options, coaching like hypnotherapy. There's some psychotherapies out there, and some, I guess, therapies using various medicines. Like, what kind of advice could you provide? And this is not medical advice, but we're just saying, like, just in general, like, how does someone go and decide, like, what type of, coaching, counseling to get? There's so many different types out there. I could just do a Google search, and then at the end of the day, it's like something speaks to me. I just got to go try it for a few months. Like, is there anything that you could suggest? I mean, I'm sure you were in this position before years ago. It's like, how do you know which, treatment to pick? And yeah, I wonder what your thoughts on that.
So, in my opinion, there's two different types of change. One is called first order change. Let's say that I'm stressed and I want to stop the stressed feelings. So I'm going to deep breathe. And then I deep breathe. I activate my vagus nerve, which begins to stop the sympathetic nervous state. And I gradually shift into the parasympathetic state. And that band-aids the symptoms for the moment. That is first order change. I don't like something about myself. I'm going to take this action and it's going to temporarily fix the problem. Okay. You can go about your life that way, putting band-aids on things, or you can try to go more deeply and cause transformational lasting change at a core level within yourself. So it's almost like you shift internally, causing yourself to gradually become a different person. The only way you can do that is by partnering with the brain, because all experience, mental, physical, and otherwise, occurs in the brain. So if whatever therapy you're choosing does not cause neurons to shift and reorganize and reflect a new way of being for yourself, then you are not causing transformational change. So that's why I love neuroscience, because I now understand that this is the way the brain will create long lasting, sustainable, everlasting change, is by following certain processes to help it move, shift, and transform. All that ice cream, which is all these different forms of therapies and coaching, if they are not causing the brain to change through neuroplasticity, reorganize itself around a new set of behaviors, thoughts, and feelings, new actions, then it will not be lasting. Okay. And the great thing about my type of coaching is I involve the person themselves in the process. So hypnotherapy is more where you're put under, you access the subconscious mind, and the therapist tells your subconscious to quit smoking, let's just say. Okay, it's telling it. But you are not actively engaged in the process of creating that change at a core level attached to your psychological primitives, the things that make you up. Okay. There's a difference between participating in the process as an active participant in change over time through repetition versus being told to do something under under hypnotherapy.
Okay. So practice and applied practice over time, that's the where it is. Like it's not so much getting advice necessarily, but you got to activate and integrate it and to your daily lives, to your what you're doing on your activities. So
Yeah, I mean, think of it as a language. Okay, like you'd like to learn Spanish. I can sit there and tell you to learn Spanish. I can put you under hypnosis and throw a bunch of Spanish words into your brain, subconscious. But when you come out, are you gonna be fluent in Spanish? Versus over time, practicing, causing your neurons to shift, causing new pathways to develop that represent this language. It's like again, causing a new root system to develop in the ground.
yeah, thanks for sharing, George. So I guess, with, I guess, regardless of what therapy speaks to you, I think the other aspect to, I guess, like, working on yourself and being a better version of yourself is like the prevention aspect. And there's, I guess, a saying is like, prevention is worth a pound of cure. I think that's kind of how it goes. So, what are yeah, if you could share a bit about like, is there some kind of practices, common routines that we can all do today to kind of strengthen ourselves, that strengthen our core and build those new neurons, those pathways to help, prevent us from, hitting that wall, which yourself and many others have. Like anything that you could say, like in our daily routines, like right now, if like we should kind of take a step back, take a look at that, and that'll kind of help us moving forward.
When you're stepping into this realm, it's great to start simple and have some success. And because once you have a little something under your belt and have experienced success and reward from it, and you begin to notice the difference it's making in your life, then your brain says, okay, that didn't kill me. It was rewarding, and I'm starting to see benefits from doing it. So let's try a little bit more then. Okay. So, you can pick things as simple as, and remember again, we talked before about trying to get the brain in its ideal functioning state. So things like diet, nutrition, exercise, sleep, maybe introducing a morning ritual into your routine, which involves maybe getting up a half an hour early, no phones, and putting together a series of practices that will set your intention for the day. Could involve, mindfulness, breathing, meditation, gratitude practice, journaling, reading, walking in nature. And you want to pick things that really resonate with you, that work for you, that you like, because you don't want to force things that you're not enjoying. Because if you're not enjoying it, your brain won't like doing them. And so, yeah, maybe just start with a morning ritual of things that will start off getting your nervous system into a parasympathetic state, very calm and relaxed, and begin to set your intention for how this day is going to go. Visualize being highly productive. Plan out your day. Visualize doing the hardest things first while your energy resources are highest. Maybe lay out your diet plan for that day, what you're going to eat and when. And, when are you going to exercise? I just think that that's maybe a great thing to begin to implement so you can begin to see the difference of how that makes a difference in how the rest of your day goes.
Excellent. Yeah, thanks for sharing, George. So, a lot of great information shared today. And, you mentioned gratitude. So, that's where I like to end off the podcast with. So, asking you this question to close. What are you most grateful for? And what are you most looking forward to in the future?
I'm most grateful for being an addict and an alcoholic because without that, I never would have changed. And so, a lot of people may ask me, do you regret that time of your life? I'm sorry you had to go through that type of thing. And I respond to them, are you kidding me? I'm so grateful that that happened because I saw the light and I was able to change as a result of it. So I'm proud of what has transpired since then, and it never would have happened without that experience. That's number one. And I'm just most looking forward to sharing transformational change with other people out there. That's why I love doing these podcasts. If I can help one person with one thing, get started, that's become my life's calling. I'm 65 years old, and that's what I want to do for the rest of my life is help people change to become better versions of themselves.
Well said, George. So, if people want to know more about you, where can they find you?
Great place is my website at georgehaymaker.com. That's George and HAYMAKER.com, or I'm on LinkedIn, George Haymaker. There is a link on my website for a free 30-minute discovery call where we can talk about kind of what you're going through, what your challenges are, see if we're a good fit to work together. But it's just, it's a free resource for you to be able to reach out, tap into me, and just, see, let's just toss some ideas around and see where you might go from there to, take your life where you want it to go.
Thanks, George. We'll be sure to add those details to our show notes. So that's a wrap for episode 33. If you like this podcast, please give it a thumbs up or hit the subscribe button below. If you have any comments, feedback, or suggestions, you know what to do. Thanks for joining us, and namaste, everyone.